I'm Bill Barbieri. I'm the director of the McLean Center for the Study of Culture and Values at the Catholic University here in DC, and I work closely with Dr. Hu in coordinating RVP's global activities. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing my screen for the presentation for today. And let's see, if you're not muted, maybe you could go ahead and mute yourself at this point to cut out background noise. Right. All right. So the topic for today, for my presentation, I'm calling Virtues and Vision in Guardini. Okay. And the reason for, let's see, is it Mamuka? Who has the noise in the background there?
Oh, yes.
Let's see. Please go ahead and mute yourselves if you haven't already. The title comes partly from the text that we're focusing on today, from Romano Guardini's major works in different fields, but it's also partly representative of a particular interest that I have in what I call visual ethics. And so one of the things that I'll do today is highlight some of the visual themes that we find in Guardini. And we've had an earlier event where we looked at links between Guardini's thought and aesthetics. And I gave a presentation at a meeting on Guardini that looked specifically at film, which is one of my interests, one of the areas that I teach in, and what Guardini had to say about film. And some of that is also present in this topic for today, where he touches in various ways on aspects of visuality and how they are related to the moral life. And that establishes a connection to my field in the US, where I'm an ethicist. I work in the field of religious ethics, and a good chunk of that literature is best represented in the work of Stanley Hauerwas, but some other ethicists as well, picks up on the link between vision and virtue, and the way in which having a particular Weltanschauung, a particular way of seeing the world, is an essential precondition for the cultivation of virtue. So that's a bit of foreshadowing. Let's first situate you with respect to where this presentation today fits into our broader programming dealing with Romano Guardini. I call it an occasional workshop series that we've been offering over the last couple of years, starting during the pandemic. We started off with our colleague at the University of Erfurt, Holger Zaborowski, talking about Guardini's critique of modernity. That was back in 2021. Then our colleague at the Gregorian University, Ivan Donash-Lobitin, gave a talk on art and Guardini, the application of Guardini's ideas to art. That was followed by another colleague of ours at the Gregorian, Joao Villachá, addressing Guardini's late writings on power and responsibility and technology in 2023. We have my presentation today on ethics, on Guardini's ethics, and more particularly his ideas about virtue. And next term in the spring, we'll have the fifth seminar in the series, again with Professor Zaborowski and Donash-Lobitin, and they'll be looking at faith and spirituality, and I think at Guardini's work on liturgy, which is an interesting topic from the standpoint of anthropology as well as from ecclesiology and other church-related fields. This series is a joint undertaking of the University of Erfurt and the Gregorian and the Catholic University of America. And I guess we should just add RVP to that. And we are also anticipating that there will be at the conclusion of the series a conference. Do we have a tentative date for that? Who? For a Guardini conference? Not at this point. Okay, but we're talking to partners in Munich and in Berlin and in Italy. So it's an event that we would project would be in Europe. Well, what I'm going to do today is run very briefly through Guardini's biography, hit some high points there. Also talk a bit about his broader approach to the teaching of ethics. And then we're going to focus in more tightly on the book that we have for today. Here's a copy of the German edition. Tugenden is the title in German, Meditationen über Gestalten sittlichen Lebens, which can be translated as meditations on forms of moral life. We'll look at his approach to the topic of virtues and the method that he employs in that particular book. I'm going to pull out some special themes of interest to me, including, as I mentioned, ways in which he touches on sight, or ways in which he can be considered as embracing what I would call an ethics of seeing. I'll have a few concluding remarks about why we're looking at Guardini, this early 20th century figure today, and what relevance we might find in his work for our contemporary period, and then we'll open things up for discussion after that. So I'll shoot for somewhere between half an hour and 40 minutes with my initial remarks. So Guardini is a figure who goes back to the 19th century, but lived through much of the very eventful 20th century, right up until the eventful period of the late 60s. He is generally viewed as certainly one of the most influential Catholic thinkers of the 20th century, but I think the influence of his thought goes beyond Catholic circles, and he was very deeply ensconced in the German philosophical tradition, and also had a lot of comments about culture, about novels, about other forms of popular culture, about emergent technologies, and about the shape of modernity and what some of the fateful contradictions and problems were that were expressing themselves through the unfolding of the modern period. So for all those reasons, he was a thinker whose work was well known in Europe, in South America, less so in this country, though. And one of the reasons that we're doing this series is to introduce some of his thought to English-speaking audiences. A number of his works are in translation, but his main work on Ethik is not, and also one of his major philosophical texts on der Gegensatz, his so-called theory of oppositions, is only now being worked out into an English translation. He was born in Italy, but moved at the age of 1 to Germany, and I think identified himself very strongly with Germany. He was educated there and pursued his academic career there, although he also spent time in Italy and maintained close connections with Italian society as well. His father was a diplomat and served in Mainz during Romano's time there. He, as a young man of 20 or so, went through a very intense crisis of faith. He had an unhappy childhood and actually experienced bouts of depression too as a young man. I think we see that reflected in his approach to ethics a little bit too. He does not articulate an account of ethics that highlights the theme of happiness or flourishing. His crisis of faith led him to focus on a career studying theology. He was always a very gifted student. And he also turned to the church. He was ordained as a Catholic priest in 1910 and cycled through several cities in Germany as an associate pastor and became involved in different places with the youth movement, with the Catholic youth movement in particular that was flourishing at the time. Of course, the Great War was a time of great trial for German society and for Europe in general. But in the years after that, there was a resurgence of interest in spirituality. And he became, as a young academic, an extraordinarily popular lecturer, even though by all accounts he wasn't a particularly good or engaging lecturer. His message carried conviction, and his public appearances were often standing room only. He became an accomplished scholar. He wrote a dissertation in 1915 and completed his habilitation, his second dissertation, on St. Bonaventure in 1922, and immediately was given a chair at the University of Berlin, now known as the Humboldt University. And there was a special chair that was created at that time in the philosophy of religion and Catholic Weltanschauung. And that's a unique description for an academic chair. It shows his breadth in philosophy. And I think that the idea of his position being defined as professing about a Catholic worldview, Weltanschauung, is significant for my theme today. He served in that position in Berlin until, I think, 1939, when the chair was shut down by the Nazi government. He remained in Berlin for a number of years and continued to do events and work with Catholic youth. But eventually he fled Berlin as well. He was not popular with the government there, but at the same time, of course, he didn't suffer some of the terrible effects of many others at the time. He was able in 1945 to reassume a chair once again in the philosophy of religion and Catholic Weltanschauung in Tübingen. He was there for just a few years before he received the call to come to Munich, and he spent the next 15 years there until his retirement in that chair, and doing many other events around Germany, working in Catholic education, working as a cultural critic, working in various other positions that we would call as a publicist today. After his retirement in 1965, he was offered an appointment as cardinal by Paul VI, but he declined. He was already quite old at that time, and he left this life in 1968 in Munich. Just a quick overview for those of you who may not be familiar with his vita. For our topic today on his writings on ethics, it's interesting that he never published a particular systematic statement on ethics. He wrote quite a bit on ethics during the early part of his career. He actually had an academic appointment in Bonn before he went to Berlin. It was a frequent topic of his during his time in Berlin and also after the war in Tübingen. And when he went back to Munich, beginning in 1950, he delivered a series of lectures on ethics, and those have been collected. They were published posthumously in two volumes. So there is a 2-volume collection of his thoughts and a number of his lectures on ethics that is not translated into English. And that is what we can think of as his mature thought work that he was doing in the latter part of his life. He became an influential figure around the time of the Second Vatican Council in the global Catholic community. That was a major period of revising the church's position toward modernity. And when it comes to ethics, Guardini is credited with having contributed to the renewal of moral theology that occurred then. Moral theology was a very a very highly regimented kind of pursuit that up until the time of Vatican II revolved around the practice of confession in Catholic circles and took a very thou shalt not kind of approach. And he was constitutionally opposed to an ethics that primarily takes the form of saying no. He wanted a more affirmative understanding of ethics. And I think that's one reason why he was drawn toward the virtues as a particular way of manifesting his ethical sensibility. I have listed on the slide here a couple of other texts that he wrote that can be thought of as broadly in the genre of morals or ethics, including the book that we're looking at today on virtues, which he wrote in 1963. It was translated not long after that into English. One of his other essays or lectures that's sometimes included here is a statement of his on the right to life, where he was speaking out about German debates about paragraph 218 of their Grundgesetz or constitution that dealt with abortion. So those are some highlights of his engagements with the topic of ethics. When we turn to his book on the virtues with the subtitle On Forms of Moral Life, we can identify a few basic features of this text that are noteworthy. First of all, he insists on noting that his approach is not a systematic approach. Rather, it's a set of interlinked, short, just a few pages, few short chapters in the form of meditations or reflections on this or that particular virtue, all of it undergirded by an introductory chapter in which he lays out the idea that virtue is essentially a unified concept that can be broken up through human experiences in different realms into more specific topics of virtue. So we can think of this book as a primer. It has a philosophical understanding of virtue that's rooted in a kind of Platonic conception of the good, but it's also theological. So in each chapter, he'll say some general things about human experience of a particular virtue, and then he'll turn to the connections that he sees as a theologian or as a philosopher of religion to the Christian understanding of God. Where do we locate this type of textual approach to ethics? When we compare it to other Catholic texts of the time, including those that were linked to the so-called tradition of manuals that were instruction for priests who were giving confession to Catholics, we see that this is a very different kind of text. And those texts relied on a rather old-fashioned conception of neo-Thomistic conception of natural law. This book and Guardini's writings on ethics in particular made very little reference to natural law. And there's a quote here from his book, Ethik. The nature of man consists in having no nature in the natural meaning. For him, the business of ethics wasn't a matter of identifying norms or of identifying fixities or set obligations that bear on and control human activity the way that many natural law theorists might do. Rather, it focused in a much more what we would think of today as a kind of existential experience of the demands of the moral life that is enacted in our interiority and comes through our relation to the good. Now, Guardini was very conversant with, especially when he was writing this book in the late 50s and 60s, with other movements in European philosophy and theology. And he recognized that there were affinities to existentialism in his emphasis on the way in which we actualize ourselves through doing, through discerning what it is right for us to do and doing that. But at the same time, he was careful to highlight the distinctions and differences between his approach and those of people like Sartre or Camus, for whom ethics was almost exclusively a matter of asserting one's own self, one's own autonomy, one's own freedom. Guardini was insistent that we don't just come to the world as unbound freedom. Rather, our freedom is only operative if we recognize the structures, the realities that bind us. So ethics is a process not of self-creation, but of discovery, of discovering the conditions that determine the challenge for our freedom, the challenge for our responsibility to pursue the good in our lives. So his approach is certainly distinct from existentialism. He was, however, influenced by Max Scheler and by the kind of personalism, the dialogical personalism that Scheler, a couple of decades earlier, had popularized in Europe. And certainly the notion of the person features prominently in Guardini's understanding of virtues. So there are some links there, although again he saw himself as doing something rather different from Scheler. He also writes in certain key places about the phenomenon, about the appearance, but his interest in phenomenology and in tracing the meaning, the significance of the phenomenon, especially in the moral life, will be quite different from somebody like Husserl's, in that he's interested not only in focusing on appearances, but recognizes that appearances are of something that is really there and has to be taken into account. In that sense, his approach is a realistic account of being, or to put it in a different term, a form of moral realism. He doesn't see morality as something that we construct ourselves, even if it's not something that's embedded in universal abstract norms that are separate from humans. It is nonetheless grounded in a good which is real. And for him, ultimately, as a Christian, it's rooted in God. For him, he also makes a distinction between ethos and ethics, and he would sometimes say that he wasn't interested in producing an ethics, or that he didn't think that one should concern oneself with trying to lay out an ethics in the sense of an ethical theory, of a set of concepts and rules and principles and obligations. In other words, as a binding theory, a normative theory. Rather, he saw himself as articulating a way of being, an ethos. Ethos was an important term that he used in a number of different contexts. And in this context, the context of ethics or of the moral life, an ethos meant the proper way of orienting ourselves and being in the world in a way that turned us toward the truth, facilitated our discernment of what the truth required of us, acknowledged that the ought, the moral ought, is inscribed in what is inscribed in being. And so he was articulating a matter of how to be in the world. For all those reasons, we can call what he was articulating, I think, an ethic of responsibility. And he does raise up the issue of responsibility, of responding to others, responding to ourselves, responding to the good, responding to God, beyond that, as the key dynamic in the moral life. And that's, again, quite different from other broad approaches to ethics that we find in, for example, a Kantian ethics of obligation, or some of the many deontological theories that were spin-offs of Kant's work, or in the whole tradition of teleological ethics of going back to Aristotle, that focuses on the moral life as contributing to human flourishing or happiness. Guardini's main motif is one of responding to the good by doing what is called for from us, what is called for from our relationships with other persons, what we owe to ourselves, what is called for in the human experience of the good. So that should give you a flavor, I hope, of his broad approach to the moral life. And I talked about how he links, how his approach is focused in a particular understanding of being. Now, we're familiar, he's certainly not the only leading thinker in the Western philosophical tradition who has focused on being as a basis for how to act. We have, for example, Socrates and his famous formulation about how to do is to be. We have Shakespeare's who poses this question of ethics in the form of a question: to be or not to be. We have Lenin, a great political figure, asking the practical question: what is to be done? Then you have a great thinker like Sartre, who we mentioned, who is placing all of his emphasis on the notion that to constitute ourselves is something we do through action. To be is to do. Some of the more recent great thinkers that we could cite in this tradition include Sinatra, doobie doobie doo. We've got Michael Jordan, just do it. If you're exposed to a lot of Western advertising, you would know the Mountain Dew slogan, which is do the do. But if we want to locate Guardini in this tradition, we might ascribe to him the motto, do the truth, or do the true, as opposed to just to be is to do. Now, I made this up on my own, and of course, much of this is an old joke about graffiti that you might find in schools of philosophy. But I think it is important to identify this fundamental connection between ethics, what one should do, the ought, and recognize that for Guardini, that is inscribed in what truly is. So our being is something that must be apprehended not as a creation of ourselves, but as a truth that is a truth in the world. And it's a truth that's ultimately grounded in something greater than ourselves. So in the book that we're looking at today, Guardini begins with an introductory chapter where he defines, where he makes some general comments about virtue. He says, for example, that virtue means that the motives, the powers, the actions, and the being of man are gathered at any given time into a characteristic whole by a definitive moral value, an ethical dominant, so to speak. That's a way of saying that virtue is at root a unity that we encounter in our lives that, again, is inscribed in our attempts to apprehend ourselves and become ourselves, to recognize and accept ourselves. And accepting oneself, by the way, is a challenging question for Guardini, who I think, again, early in his adulthood, himself pondered suicide. So the affirmation of oneself is necessary, the affirmation of others, the affirmation of the good. And the good has a wholeness to it. It's an integral value that we experience, but we can experience it in different ways or different aspects. And those become what we speak of as individual virtues. So virtues are for him an expression of, as I just said, a unitary good. And it's important to recognize that this good is apodictic. It's not grounded in anything else. It's not founded in some other qualities of being, for example. The good is, in that sense, unfounded. We might describe it as an axiom. And ethics and human attempts to exercise their freedom and to actualize themselves build on that axiomatic premise of the good. And the lives that humans leave witness to the validity and the existence of the good. Now, when he writes about different virtues, he recognizes that virtues can have central themes, but that individual virtues are never isolated. So if we're talking about virtues like patience, or one of his interesting discussions is of the virtue of courtesy, we should recognize that those virtues always include and are supported by other virtues as well. They interweave to support the moral life. They amalgamate different elements. And I'll point that out using a couple of examples as we go forward. A crucial term for Guardini is the conscience. And that here he probably is drawing on a kind of Christian anthropology developed through Catholic tradition, through a Thomistic understanding of the conscience. But he has a somewhat modernized understanding of the conscience. He doesn't boil it down to or locate it in any one particular place. It's a kind of holistic organ that people have that is defined precisely by its ability to determine what the requirements are of the moral life, of the good life. And as I'll suggest a little bit later, it's a way of seeing the world in a way that highlights value. Guardini also builds on the prevalence in the early part of the 20th century, largely thanks to Martin Buber, the great Jewish philosopher, of the I-thou dyad, the I-thou relationship. And he often brings that up in discussing individual virtues. Why is it, or how does it function to become, to practice justice, or to practice reverence, or to practice acceptance? These will often be virtues that he articulates in terms of our relationships to other people, which can't allow our relation to be clouded through our own interests or our own vanity, which involve a full giving of space to other people that honors or pays reverence to their status as a thou in a way that is not simply an alter ego, another form of the I, but has its own autonomy, its own dignity, its own worth that is distinct from and different from our own self. At the root of Guardini's ethics of virtue is the good, the agaton, the idea that for him, as I mentioned, can be understood philosophically, but ultimately has a theological anchor or root to it. And so God is the ground. Sometimes he equates God with the good. The aim to be good is, for him, a form of turning ourselves toward the ground of all being, God, for whom life is a gift. He movingly, in one phrase, describes ourselves as Gabe und Aufgabe. It's a kind of play on the German words for a gift and a task, a challenge, an Aufgabe. We have a calling that we are obliged to live up to. And that orients us toward that dimension of God that is described as holy. In the German realm, holiness is often linked to goodness. in its basic sense. Now, one of the most interesting and distinctive things about Guardini's primer on virtue is that he doesn't only suggest that that human virtues are somehow God regarding or linked to God. He also takes up the idea in each one of his chapters that God has virtues and that God can and should be thought of as being loyal, or as displaying reverence, or as showing understanding or kindness. Now, or showing gratitude. Now, that's an interesting and unusual kind of philosophical strategy to attempt to show that God, who is ineffable and impenetrable and inscrutable in many ways, can nonetheless meaningfully be thought of as, in some sense, embodying gratitude or unselfishness or kindness or courage or even asceticism. He usually does this at the end of each chapter, where he takes up the question of how God can be thought of as embodying these virtues. Now, he doesn't want to say that God has these virtues or that they're possessions of God, but in a similar sense, he doesn't want to say that people possess virtues. People embody virtues, and there's for him a divine model for doing that. Well, let's take a quick look at the list of virtues that Guardini considers in his book. There are 16 of them. Actually, justice gets a couple of treatments. Justice in what I would call the biblical sense of mishpat, of fairness to others, but also justice under God in the sense of the biblical value, the Old Testament value, the Hebrew scriptures value of tzedakah, or righteousness in one's relation to God's requirements. Some of these will sound very familiar. Justice, for example. Some of them sound a little bit unusual, and that might partly be a matter of translation from the German. For example, recollection. I think probably, I didn't look it up, but in German it's Erinnerung, is an unusual virtue. Courtesy is an unusual virtue as well. But in each case, he provides a rationale for why he's decided to comment on these particular ways of being good. And the ones in red here, I picked out for various reasons in order to take a closer look at. So let's look at the very first one that he treats, truthfulness, and register a few of the things that he says about it. First of all, it's noteworthy that truthfulness is the very first virtue that he addresses. And he says at one point, our whole existence depends upon truth. And he means that in both human and social terms, our own existence as a person really depends upon discerning the truth and then living according to the directives that are inscribed in that truth. But also, society doesn't function. You can't have a working community. You can't have a civilization if truthfulness is not honored, and if a love of truth, which he links to the virtue of truthfulness, is not cultivated. He shows that truthfulness isn't a simple black and white value where we are always absolutely required to tell the truth. In fact, there can be situations where the other person does not have a right to hear the truth from us. And there can be conditions where we are obliged to make prudential judgments about how to frame the truth or how much to say of the truth. And in that experience, a mastery of language are preconditions for giving an appropriate, an answer that is true and good. Throughout his work, not surprisingly in this time and place, he was concerned to highlight what we might describe as immoral features of totalitarianism. And here too, he shows that people who engage in violence and totalitarian actions can cause speech to lose its meaning and undermine the very possibility of truthfulness. In order to live truthfully and in order to speak truthfully, some of the other related virtues that he touches on in this chapter are tact and kindness and courage. Those latter two get chapters of their own later on. He emphasizes that truth is not something that only comes up in our relations to others. We have to be true to ourselves. We have to practice truth toward ourselves. We have to prevent ourselves from engaging in self-delusion. Truth is the means by which one becomes stable and attains character. And this is a common feature of virtue-based ethics. Virtue, having a set of virtues, becomes linked to the idea of having a certain kind of core to our being, which is expressed in the word character. So we're talking here not about whether somebody is a character or what type of personality traits they have. We're talking about their moral character, whether they have integrity and an ability to cultivate goodness in themselves and to stand up for the requirements of the good. Finally, at the end of the chapter, Guardini turns to the links between truth and God, and he comments that truth is the way in which God is God and knows himself. So the virtue of truth for humans is ultimately rooted in a certain sense in which God can be thought of as embodying truth. Let's take a look at another virtue. Maybe I'll just do, well, I'll do very quickly unselfishness and silence. Another common motif of Guardini's are ways in which humans differ from mere animals. And one is that animals don't have selves. They can't know themselves and possess themselves and exercise freedom in the way that humans can. So the first question about understanding unselfishness for Guardini is what is the self in the first place? He identifies an interesting kind of paradox. When we depart from ourselves, when we give up our self-interest in relationships and serve disinterestedly and objectively, we uncover our true self. He says the more a person seeks himself, the more he slips away from himself. So if we focus on self and become obsessed with self and our own self-interest, we slip away from our true self. On the other hand, when we give up our selfishness, we approach our true self. God, he says, is sovereignly unselfish through the act described in the Bible in Philippians of divine kenosis, where God comes down to the earth and pours out God's being into a slave and servant in the form of Jesus, practicing a type of the ultimate variety of selflessness, self-annihilation. Silence is an odd virtue to include here. As Guardini does in much of his work, including in his theory of oppositions, or the Gegensatz, he talks about silence and speech as two poles that exist in a kind of tension with each other. He says that animals can't practice silence, nor can these new talking machines. Why? Because when they talk or make noise, they're not really practicing speech in the relevant sense. And since they don't have the ability of speech, they can't enact stillness in the same way that people can. To be silent is to accept oneself. It's necessary in order to accept oneself and the other. We don't inject noise into ourselves or into our relationships. We truly take account of the other in their state as person. He says, only in silence is true knowledge attained. Let us strive to become silent so that we may learn to be human. That's a familiar expression for RVP. God paradoxically combines silence and the word in one. So those are some of the little nuggets of insight that Guardini brings to his discussion of individual virtues. As we begin to wrap things up, I do want to highlight some special themes that are addressed in this book. One of them, as I mentioned, is that Guardini has a very dismissive attitude toward animals, non-human animals. He uses them as a kind of foil for his development of features that he associates exclusively with humanity, like conscience and understanding and responsibility. And so there's a kind of deep anthropocentric bias that informs this part of his anthropology. He does have a lot to say about dignity, and that was in a time when dignity was only just beginning to come into real currency in political debates, in national constitutions, even in discussions or documents of the Catholic Church, like the documents of Vatican II. But Guardini had a deep understanding of the character of dignity and how it is bound up with the idea of virtue. One interesting feature to me was a few points in his argument where he drew in or established comparisons or invoked implicitly other religious traditions. At a number of points, he draws in Indian or Hindu tradition or myth as a way of highlighting a different understanding between the divine and the world. Shiva is highlighted as a kind of impatient god who periodically destroys the world only to refashion it, as someone who is not loyal to the world in the same way that the Christian God is. But in Guardini's discussion of courtesy, of the virtue of courtesy, he adapts a strongly kind of Confucian mode of argumentation, and he talks about the importance of moral self-education and even something like ritual propriety. Maybe it's his discussion of kindness instead of courtesy. Now I'm not sure which one that was. Throughout his discussion, as I mentioned, there are examples showing how the totalitarian spirit and totalitarian practices are opposed to this moral conception of virtue that Guardini is articulating. There are even, one could argue, points of contact with what we could describe today as ecological consciousness, because Guardini sees the world as embodying a certain kind of goodness that is part of the moral call that humans experience. That's a topic maybe we can go into more deeply if anyone wants to talk about it, but I wanted to just say a few words about this idea of visuality and the role that it plays for Guardini. He very often highlights the importance of images, and indeed he describes his method as using images as they present themselves in human experience in order to unfold the meaning of virtue. He says that, and as befits one whose chair was in Weltanschauung, Christian worldview, that we need to cultivate the ability to see the world and the demands on us that it embodies. He also highlights dangers that are associated with the visual in a kind of, in the best Platonic tradition. He warns of the temptation to dream ourselves into imaginary virtues, to fantasize about our own powers and ways in which we can conquer the world around us and build up our own greatness. For him, these are counterproductive practices that drain our moral energy. He highlights the importance of truly attending to, paying attention to the other and seeing the other as a person. Noting that we learn really to understand ourself only when we regard ourselves from another's point of view. So seeing is a crucial building block of the moral life there. Finally, he mentions that for the Christian, virtue can be interpreted as taking on the gaze of Christ, of trying to see the world, imagining for ourselves what Christ would take to be needed for any particular situation. Of course, he also, in the best Christian anthropological tradition, makes much of the notion that humans are uniquely created in the image and likeness of God. And for him, that isn't just a metaphor. It really does mean that there's a way in which humans embody this being and truth that has its ultimate expression in God. So when you put all these things together, you realize that the life of virtue for Guardini is dependent on a particular type of vision that we train on ourselves, that we train on our neighbors, that we train on the world around us in order to determine what is required of us, that we train on the good, recognizing that there is a real good that is operative in the moral life. And finally, for the Christian, on contemplation of the divine. Well, that's an overview then of the particular text that we have and Guardini's approach to ethics. If I situate it more broadly in our series of occasional events, we can sum up by saying that Guardini is in some ways an old-fashioned figure, but in other ways his ideas seem to have contemporary relevance or even renewed relevance, whether it's his critique of modernity or his analysis of the politics of power and of the ethics of responsibility. He still has interesting things to say about technology and how our technology shapes us even as we shape it. Many people have remarked that Romano Guardini was a primary influence on the current Pope, Pope Francis. Francis was supposed to write a dissertation on Guardini, although he never completed it. And almost uniquely, he has cited him as a philosopher in documents like Laudato Si, where normally the convention is simply to cite other church documents. So I do have some colleagues in Germany who are interested in organizing a conference devoted specifically to the impact that Guardini has on Pope Francis's papacy. For philosophers, his thought about the Gegensatz, about the contradiction or the opposition, the kind of ontological relation that plays out in many different areas of life, including art and culture, remains a source of fascination. And for me personally, I want to trace an intellectual affinity between Guardini's ethic of virtue and certainly some of the more recent defenders of virtue. In modern moral philosophy, people sometimes distinguish between deontological ethics and teleological ethics and virtue ethics. And there's certainly a number of philosophers and theologians, including people like H. Richard Niebuhr and Alistair MacIntyre and Stanley Hauerwas, who are working and the novelist Iris Murdoch, for that matter, who wrote a book called The Sovereignty of Good that shares the conception of the fascination with vision and the conception of good in a Platonic sense, which are can very much be placed in continuity with Guardini's thought. And in that way, his ethical thought continues to unfold itself today. So I'll stop with that observation, and I'll thank you all for your attention, and let's open things up for any questions or comments. that you might have. And you can use you can just speak up. I think we're a small enough group. We're under 20. Or if you want, you can use the raise hand function. But I'm happy to have any comments or queries that you might have. Mamuka?
Thank you, Professor Barbieri. Such kind of meeting is very helpful for me, and I also we're very glad to meet you. And I have some questions about your report.
No,
I think that there is no essential difference between Husserl's phenomenology and Guardini's phenomenology, to my mind, because in Husserl's phenomenology, the main thing is the construction of the knowledge within the consciousness. And in Guardini's, we have the construction of moral life within the reality. The main thing is the construction. The method of construction is the same in Husserl and in Guardini also. So it is a similarity between them, I think, to my mind. Is this. Despite the different spheres, they have one and the same method of construction of knowledge or construction of moral life. And the other, my question depends on the, I read in your comments before the report, that making the goodness is more preferable than to keep the God's commandments. But I think that in this case, the goodness and God's commandments and other points of spiritual religious life are only the ways to reach the one and the same goal. It is the grace of God. The grace of God is the one and main purpose of the Christian believer. And the other ways is goodness or is fasting or religious life or religious tradition and others are only the ways to reach this main point of our belief. Thank you. That's two points.
Okay, very good. Thank you for both of those comments and questions. So I think I'll accept your point that there's a lot of common ground between Guardini and Husserl, as far as they are interested in the same objects. So in the what we might call the description of experience or the epistemology there, I think that Guardini recognizes some of the same dynamics, the sedimentation of knowledge, for example, that Husserl writes about, but he's not prepared to bracket the question of experience in the same way. And I think he would be more on Husserl's side than somebody like Sartre, for example. But ultimately for him, the phenomenon that appears has to be understood as divine. And I don't know that Husserl can get us, can take us that far in his understanding of the appearance, the phenomenon. On the question of commandments, I think we certainly shouldn't assume that Guardini it wants to discard the commandments and the role of commandments in Jewish and Christian tradition. But my point was about where he wants to put his emphasis or his focus in his description of the moral life. And there his interest really is very much on making the matter of determining what it is good to do an internal, a matter that is determined in interiority and in a positive way, rather than something that is regulated from outside through norms or through commandments, thou shalt not. He does recognize, though, and he sometimes does use the language of obligation, because he says that our perception of a situation can obligate us. He says that most obviously in his very first discussion of truthfulness, where he does say that telling the truth is obligatory for us. So, you could look at that and say he's saying something that's kind of similar to the commandment not to lie, but he's saying it in a way that inverts it, first of all, and that makes it come from the internal relationship to God, rather than to a portentous God who issues from afar commandments that constrain our activities. So I would want to highlight that there's still important differences there, even though we, as a Christian, obviously Guardini is not going to say we can dispense with the commandments. And he does, one thing that I didn't mention is that his view of how Christians discern the good draws heavily on revelation. So he really does understand that the scriptures are indispensable for Christians in this task.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, interesting. When I was reading this book, and it reminded me of Aristotle, but it seems Guardini always referred, as you mentioned, back to Plato on the goodness, and back to Greece. And what do you compare with Guardini and Aristotle on virtue, the Nicomachean Ethics?
Mm-hmm.
Aristotle also lists all the virtues.
Well, there are some similarities and differences. I think that he assumes some basic Aristotelian points about virtue, about its link to habits and how it can be cultivated in certain ways. I think he probably goes further than Aristotle in thinking about the unity of the virtues. And so he's not going to have the whole kind of taxonomy that Aristotle develops in regard to the virtues. Aquinas later on, for example, would talk about parts of virtue, or elements of virtue. There's a similarity to what he's doing when he shows that virtues like kindness and courage need to be included in the practice of truthfulness. But ultimately, he really sees virtue as one before it is a set, a nicely organized set of rationally accessible individual virtues. For him, Christ is the ground of virtue. And insofar as one attempts to be Christ-like, they are practicing virtue. And the different parts of the Christian tradition appropriate Aristotle in ways that go in a somewhat different direction, I think. I don't want to say that he's an antinomian, though, that he thinks that there are no rules, that it's just a matter of, or for that matter, that he is what has come to be called, since the time he was writing in the 60s or even late 50s, situation ethicist, that he thinks you can just judge from the individual situation what the moral course of action is. One commentator who's written about his ethics says he's not doing situation ethics, he's doing or Situationsethik, he's doing Seinsethik, an ethic of sein, an ethic of being. So that's we have to be careful about points of contact with the metaphysics of virtue, or with opposite extremes like the idea of antinomianism. Giorgio.
Professor Barbieri, thank you for your beautiful presentation. Only one question. There is a part of a production of Romano Guardini which explores the Divine Comedy
Really?
and the works of Dante, Die Dantische Studien, in his university lectures. So in this production, there is a focus on the theme of virtues and the visual theme of virtues. A reflection on this point, if it is possible.
Well, just a couple of things. I wish I could say I've read that. I haven't. I'm aware that there's a very large corpus of Guardini's writings and lectures that were devoted to literature, and I think that of course Dante would be one of the first people that you would think of. It never ceases to strike me how important Dante is to the Western philosophical tradition, not just literary, but philosophical and theological. Now, one of the questions that your observation put me in mind of is, and this goes back to whose question about the link to Aristotle as well. Some people have raised the issue: what does Guardini have to say about vices? You know, the opposite of virtue, or what does he have to say about evil? And in point of fact, he didn't. I don't think he adopted the whole Aristotelian conception of virtues being opposed by vices. He didn't have a lot to say about vices. What he had to say about evil was that the good he understands as a very large set of demands, a call that we experience to turn ourselves toward the good and to recognize in our reality demands to act in certain ways. Evil becomes what is outside of what the good demands for us. It's almost like a leftover concept. It's not specifically the absence of good or the privation of goodness, but it's just a kind of what's left over when we don't pursue the good. And so it would be curious for me to see how his thinking about evil or about the seven deadly sins or the other vices that shape the Divine Comedy to some extent in Dante, how he would analyze those. And that would be one of the things I would be intrigued to learn more about. Do you have any insights into that?
Okay, we will speak about this.
Yeah.
Because I am writing a commentary about Divine Comedy, and this is a possible focus.
Yeah, I'm going to Rome next year to teach at the Catholic University campus there. So I think part of my trip will have to be an intensive study of Dante and commentaries on Dante.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much.
Oh, yes, thank you. Other Guardini fans or people who are just perplexed by this text. Normally, we try to encourage people to read at least a couple of excerpts from the book that we'll be discussing, especially if it's not widely available. But we didn't ask you to do homework in preparation for this seminar this time around. Although, I'm glad to see that you picked up a copy of the text, and we're working our way through it. Let's see if we can get a couple of more reflections from you on this topic.
How about from Africa? Okay. Oh, we have another hand.
Balogun. Let's see, you're muted. I don't know if you're trying to speak. Balagun, Oladapo, I can't see the rest. Yes, Professor Masolo. You're also muted.
All right, there we go. Yeah, Professor Barbieri, I've enjoyed your presentation. I've not read what the philosopher you were presenting on at all. So this was a learning occasion for me, and I found it very interesting. But while learning from your presentation and hoping to pick up one of his texts later on, I'm always intrigued by Western ethicists who tend to focus on individual goodness, which is the real focus of the concept of virtues in Western philosophy, all the way from antiquity up to now. And with that given, the orientation, the reasons as to why we need virtues often then tends to drive the thinkers outside the human realm itself, except of course with the exception of the existentialists, particularly Jean-Paul Sartre. But from a different angle, there are philosophers who tend to think that the idea of the relationship between human goodness, the goodness of the person, and the deities and God, is something that comes later. It's something as kind of post-experience, so to speak, something a posteriori, so to speak, yeah, from an epistemological point of view. And this is the ground for saying that. I'm reading a philosopher. Well, I'm calling him a philosopher. This is an interesting figure, writer, thinker, who was Muslim, brought up as a Muslim, but got very disaffected by what he believed to be an experience or evidence of hypocrisy in many of Muslim believers. Therefore, very skeptical of what he calls truthfulness of the human soul, and driving him to think that this idea that people believe in goodness or in developing and cultivating good character and cultivating life of virtues is always in service of something else, something ulterior to human experience. To human experience itself is something that is for him then hardly intellectually acceptable or not satisfying from the point of view understanding what it is that and reason. I found very interesting some of the quotations you gave us from Guardini. Nature, what was, I found that very interesting. Human nature or not, right? There are three different uses or appearances of the word
right.
nature and natural or something. You know, at the very beginning, I believe. So,
Yeah, let's see. It was the nature of man consists in having no nature in the natural meaning.
There we go.
Yeah.
But I found that very interesting because the person, the writer I'm talking about says, look, the only experience that humans have when they come into the world is the experience of the other, which brings to mind, of course, closeness to Martin Buber, I and thou, right?
Sure, or Levinas, yeah.
Or Levinas, yes, indeed, for that matter. Interesting that it comes through Jewish philosophers very strongly in that sense. And this person, he says, the only experience humans have when they come into the world is the sharing of experience with the other. Because humans, he says, humans are never alone. You're not a human if you're alone. And human nature was never meant for a life or experience of solitude, of solitary, right? Experience and solitary life, and so on and so forth. So I said, look, which is the reason why Americans in the US, we have all this myth about the Bigfoot, for example, who is a proto-human because he was never human, right? And we can't think of Bigfoot as human because Bigfoot is, so we think of them in that sense only because they are deprived of human experience, the experience of the other. Yeah, that makes all of us human. So, so this person says, look, virtues are first and foremost for the sharing of experience with others, with other humans. And he says, we have reason for a purpose, which makes righteousness, in fact, for him, the most fundamental and primary virtue on which all the others get to be built. And he thinks of virtue as, he thinks of righteousness as a virtue of reason. Yeah, and a virtue of good use of reason, that which makes us be able to realize our likeness in the other, and in order to be able to be good, to continue to cultivate a life that is, in fact, appropriately human. All these other things, including our draw towards the divine, are things that come as afterthoughts, as a way of projecting the goodness that we believe in as part of how we become human, we stay human, with experience with the other, and then project it to something that we think is almost ulterior, something beyond that which is human. But he says that is always too much of a stretch of human reason, yeah, because human reason is not limited. That is, he says, that is the goodness of it. It is not limited. So we are okay. We are free to have these projections. But he says virtues is meant for nowhere other than.
What is the name of this Muslim thinker?
This is he's called Shaban Robert. Shaban Robert. Shaban Shaban Yeah, Shaban Robert. That's how you will find him. He never wrote in English, unfortunately. All his texts were written in Kiswahili, but very interesting texts in Kiswahili. Yeah.
Oh, please put his name in the chat. But you know, it's that does highlight some differences in this approach to virtue. And you know, on the one hand, we can highlight the the understanding of virtue as individual or even individualistic versus something that is communally mediated, or that exists only in society, when you need to have mechanisms like virtue to regulate interactions in a community. I think that Guardini is an individualist in this sense, or he wouldn't say individualist, he would say personalist. For him, the idea of the person is this kind of sacrosanct understanding. Animals can be thought of as individuals, but he applies the term person instead of individual to humans, because he thinks that they have this capacity for all the things we mentioned, understanding and speech. I found the things he had to say about speech and silence quite interesting, actually, and that we can only know another person, or only know ourselves, or only know God in silence. The bottom line, though, for Guardini, and what distinguishes him from the perspective that you were describing, is that there's a sense in which his account of virtue is the virtue of the person who is born again who is a kind of convert to goodness. And he recognizes, you mentioned hypocrisy as a problem that we always have to be aware of. For Guardini, he recognizes that people have something that Christians usually term sin, something like original sin that they have to be aware of and constantly contend with, and they can only overcome that through the redemption that emerges from having a certain relationship to God. So in order to be good, the person has to fully accept the good, and for Guardini and for a Christian, that means accept Christ and this renewed relationship to God's justice. And only then is one in a position to overcome the limitations of sin. So I think that's one of those areas where there are actual theological differences between Islam and Christianity that play into and inform Guardini's understanding. I also think that there's a kind of ethnocentrism in his, that his view is very much shaped by European perspectives, European debates. And the last thing that I'll say is that, having done some work myself over the decades in comparative ethical study, and looked at Confucian ethics, and looked at some different broad approaches to the moral life, I do think you can find some version of a theory of virtue in most traditions. I think that that's one of the most durable, one of the most useful cross-cultural tools for promoting understanding among ethical systems, because it is rooted in features like habituation that are very prosaic and broadly shared. We do have a couple of other questions up now. Let's see if we can get this in. Mm-hmm. Sophia? I saw you checked in earlier. Sophia?
Yes. Okay.
Balogun.
In short, okay. Thank you for your dense presentation. I would like to ask if the topic of the topic of virtues here is connected to the distinction of essence and person, meaning nature and person in God's attributes, and therefore God's virtues are ontological mainly, or personal elements. Something that goes back to the silent quarrels on 16th and 14th century in Christendom. Thank you.
Yeah, I think if I got that correctly, let's see, I'm getting an echo here now. If I got that correctly, yes, the notion of person goes back to a formulation in Aquinas about what it means, for example, to possess dignity. It's bound up with this idea of personhood, and it goes back ultimately to Boethius, I think. But that is an understanding of person that I think that Guardini is presuming here. And in fact, it's ultimately a Trinitarian notion. So from the side of Christian theology, the understanding of the person is bound up with the theology of the three persons of the Trinity and the way in which they have these internal relationships among each other. So I do think that, I mean, it raises an interesting question, which is, to what extent can Guardini's philosophical claims, his Platonic claims about the good and about virtue, stand on their own apart from his theological presuppositions? And I'm not sure, actually, that finally they can stand without those Christian assumptions behind them. Yeah. Balogun, can we get you there?
Yeah.
What should we call you?
Hello, I'm here.
Yes. Okay. Take it away.
Yeah. Good evening, sir. Hello.
Yes, we hear you.
Yeah. First, I want to say thank you for the opportunity. I just have a simple clarification about my understanding of the reading of the text. I've not read it, but from Professor Masolo's discussion,
You are muted, Balogun.
Mm-hmm.
He
So
got muted.
what was it about the text? Oh, he's muted again. Yeah.
Right.
understand that. Because,
You're back.
No, then he got muted again.
Okay.
okay. Let me go out.
Well, we can try that again, or we could put a question in the chat too. That works too.
Well, maybe I should do that.
Okay.
I'm just trying, sir. I'm just trying to ask the question that in virtue ethics, which virtue is very important to as a tool of understanding? Could it not be that there must be use of figures of speech to be metaphor? Because literature is important in bringing out the idea.
Mm-hmm. Well, you got muted again, but let me say something about that because it does raise an interesting question for Guardini and his discussion of truthfulness, which, as you said, is a very important virtue for him. And one of the points that he made about that is that it's very difficult to be truthful if we don't have a subtle command of language, if we can't make fine distinctions of meaning, if we can't inject nuance that makes our presentation of what we know to be true complex. He doesn't think, for example, that when the Nazis come and knock on your door and ask you if you're hiding any Jewish refugees that you should tell the truth. But he does want to say that you make judgments, you use prudence, but you also use your commanded language to make what counts as a truthful reply there, even if you just don't tell them the black and white situation. Now,
Okay.
when it comes to literature and metaphor, Guardini shares a little bit. Plato was famously suspicious of artists and of certain kinds of images, right? And because he thought that they detracted from the truth. Guardini, he has some dismissive things to say. For example, he's very critical of television and the way that television and the stories that it tells puts noise in our lives, and it generates flippant stories that distract our attention, and it keeps us from focusing on the really important things. He said the same thing about movies, in as much as he meant movies that were popular entertainments of the day. But when he was pushed on it, he found that there were some movies, like the Bicycle Thief, that's one of them that I recall that he very much valued, which actually did represent something approaching great art and therefore embodied a certain kind of truthfulness. And so for him, it's a matter of being able to distinguish between kitsch, or between inferior metaphors, inferior literature, inferior images, inferior movies, and artistic expressions, which he had great value for and which he thought had a disclosive power to communicate something about truth or something about goodness. So these are some of the nuances that he wants us to be aware of in his discussion of virtue. I hope that's a helpful response. Michal.
Oh, good to hear you, Bill.
Oh, now you've got an echo. Are you on a phone and a video, a computer? Pick one of them.
You can hear me? Oh, all right.
All right, let's see. Or maybe two, you could try.
Right now it's better?
Oh yeah, that's good. Yeah.
Okay, I have a question for you because of you included into the virtues also the understanding.
Yes.
Yes, so why the understanding is virtue for Romano?
Good question. Yeah.
It is so rare, or it is too much ignored around, so it is only for few reserve a virtue to be to get the understand. It is not so common. Of course, he put it because of the virtue of truthfulness that we have to submit by the understanding, probably. And you mentioned in your explanation many places that it's related to that, but put it as a separate virtue, the understanding. Why he did it?
It's a good question.
Maybe
Let
also
me go ahead.
Because the modernism which comes after the Second World War, more and more popular, and therefore he tried to make some boldness of people who understand, or let me describe what you understand from the Romano Guardini about the understanding as a virtue.
Okay, so he does recognize that understanding is a little bit maybe unorthodox as a virtue. I think he means it primarily in the sense that we would say in English that My teacher is very understanding. She's a very understanding person. We don't mean that she understands me when I talk to her. We mean that she is something like forgiving, or that she is judicious and the opposite of judgmental. So in talking about the understanding as a virtue, Guardini is talking about two things that can be distinguished from each other. On the one hand, understanding is crucial in the moral life because morality depends on understanding other people's intentions and their thoughts. It depends on having awareness of what's going on in somebody else's head, and being able to perceive the inner life of other people is something that some people are very bad at, and some people are good at, and it's a valuable skill to have. He actually says there are several different strata or levels at which we understand people. We try to see, we try to hear, we try to feel what it's like to be in their position. And it's crucial because it builds it's our way of bridging the distance between persons. We can't understand people very well unless we have certain preconditions, like life experience. It's hard to understand somebody if you don't have much experience yourself. Understanding, he says, is necessary to give other people freedom, the freedom to be what they are, and not to impose our own expectations and our own demands on them. So that's one sense of simply being able to put ourselves in the place of another person. That's a fundamental skill if you want to apply the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Well, we don't know what they would do unto us unless we can understand where they're coming from. The second sense of understanding is this idea of having compassion for the other. When we understand somebody, we reserve judgment on them and try to excuse or not too abruptly condemn something in them that is different from us. That's where Guardini remarks, and I included this quote on one of my slides, we learn really to understand ourselves only when we regard ourselves from another's point of view. Ultimately, he takes up the question, as he does in each of these chapters, of what it means to say that God understands us. And doesn't take too much imagination to see where he's going with that. God created and knows us. God sees our misjudgments and the grounds for why we do good or ill, and is able to comprehend and forgive under many conditions. So that's some of what Guardini has to say in his chapter about understanding and why that's a virtue.
No, thank you.
Adrian.
Thank you. And I did enjoy the presentation as well. And unfortunately, I didn't have opportunity to read the text, but I did take a few notes that I thought interesting. One, very briefly, is about interpretation of existence. For an example, he mentioned Shiva. And for him, his interpretation was impatience. And I've heard other interpretations of Shiva, the destroyer of forms, related to becoming, how things change. But my question is going to be not towards that, but towards what he considers imagination and fantasy. Such would consume moral energy. And when I heard that, of course, I'm thinking about pictorial images that I have of Moses and other great leaders who for an example, Moses climbed the mount, had this calling or relationship with the fire. So my question is, how would he go about for us distinguishing truth from fantasy? It's not very clear, not even for people who perceived Moses, whether or not he was the deliverer, but for Moses himself, who had to come into some kind of recollection or some kind of thought processes about what he could do, parting the waters. Did he imagine it first? Because that must engage in something that's so atypical. So specifically, my question is, how do we distinguish? Does he give us a guideline for knowing what is true for us and what is fantasy?
Okay. Yeah, it's an interesting question. And there's a line of philosophers who've wrestled with this problem going back to Kant and Coleridge, and ultimately Sartre wrote two books about the imagination, and part of it was about, you know, how we identify delusion or fantasy. Let me tell you first what Guardini has to say about this. This is from his chapter on acceptance, on the virtue of acceptance. And acceptance is a virtue because we have to accept, first of all, this is a really hard thing for him. We have to accept ourself as being the kind of being that we are, that has demands placed on us, that aspires to personhood, that is drawn to the good, that needs space, that needs silence. There are many things in modern life, he says, that makes it hard for us to even really accept ourselves. But then he goes on and he says, once again, he's contrasting the situation of humans with animals. Animals don't have this problem of acceptance. Humans do. The human is not absorbed in his own being and environment the way that a non-human animal would be. He can depart from himself and think about himself. He can judge himself and can raise his desires above what he is to that which he would like to be or should be. Indeed, he can lift himself in fancy to the impossible. And fancy is another term that's used often interchangeably with fantasy to mean a mistaken imagining, right? So there arises a tension between his actual being and his desires, which may become a principle of growth insofar as he keeps before him in his striving an image of himself which he seeks to overtake with that which he really is. So we're trying to become something that we aren't really, but that we would like to be. The tension may also cause a harmful split, a flight from one's own reality, a fantasy existence which disregards the given possibilities and also the threatening dangers. This is what we meant when we said that all effective moral striving must begin with a man's sincere acceptance of existence as it is. So the bottom line here is that he's a realist when it comes to morality, and he thinks that humans have the ability to determine what the good is, what is really going on, and what that demands of us. But he also recognizes that we have a tendency to delude ourselves or to fool ourselves or to try to be bigger than our britches, try to be more than what we can be in the moment. The answer to your question, I think he thinks, is that reality is going to come back to bite you if you get carried away with your fantasies. But maybe later rather than sooner that might happen. But as a realist, he thinks that if we fail to be realistic in our perception of what we can do and what we ought to do, then we're going to run into trouble.
If he were still alive, what do you think he would say about us reaching the moon?
Reaching the moon? Certainly there were, the space program was going on in the last days of his life. We had satellites up, late 60s. So
But
what were
that
you going to
was
say?
once a dream, and it was a far out dream, a fanciful dream, mostly for the poets. Do you think that would be an aim that he would want to squash for mankind? Or what would his view be now that we have arrived?
Yeah, he by the way, for those of you who haven't read any of Guardini, if you're just going to read one thing of his, then I might recommend his book on power and responsibility. It's a book that he wrote to kind of follow up his main critique of the modern age. And it was shaped very much by things like the arms race and the history of world wars of Europe in the 20th century. But he did have specific criticisms to make of technology. But I don't think he was a Luddite or opposed to all technological or scientific advances. He was very critical of the ways in which technology could amplify some of our more pathological tendencies. And he perceived, for example, that television was deeply reshaping our lives and the way we spent our time, and that a lot of it was noise and very little of it was real qualitative, artistically valuable material. So going to the moon might be a testament to the human capacity to build civilization and build culture and build scientific knowledge. On the other hand, it might be ultimately a misspent energy when we have massive problems here on Earth that remain unaddressed while our focus is on this very expensive process of projecting ourselves to another planet. I'm actually not sure where he would come down on that. I don't think he would just reject space flight as a legitimate human aspiration. Maybe I don't know, if Joao were here, I'd be interested to hear what he had to say about that, because he did do our presentation on technology and power and responsibility. And you can ask, for example, was the reason that we were putting all these resources toward getting to the moon determined by the arms race, the space race, the Cold War, the ideological competition between East and West? Of course, now we're getting ready to slingshot an explorer out in the direction of Jupiter. We're taking the next step.
Thank you.
I think that theologically speaking, Guardini felt that humans are not under a moral obligation to leave the earth alone. I think the way that he read Genesis and the creation, the Christian creation and Jewish creation stories, was in a way that acknowledged that humans have a kind of not just capacity, but or incentive, but a responsibility to shape and contribute to the earth. I teach a course right now that's called Ethics and Stewardship, and it has stewardship in the title because that's the term that the Christian churches have adopted to describe how humans ought to take care of the earth. I don't know that Guardini would have liked the term stewardship. He liked to talk about co-creator, about humans as having a task, an Aufgabe of co-creating human culture, but also an earth that is not exploited, but which serves the creation of expressions of human personhood. And people are charged to do that, not just for themselves, but as part of a call to carry out a task that they were created for by a creator. And you can find that in Muslim tradition, you can find it in Christian tradition. Khalifa is the one of the terms in Muslim tradition that's used for this kind of idea. Well, we're at the hour. You've been very patient and stuck with a long presentation, so I thank you for that. And I hope that you'll keep with our series out of your own interest, and that maybe you'll go look into some of these texts. We will be advertising one that is projected for March sometime soon, and I'll hope to see you all again then, or if not there, then at one of our RVP meetings around the world. Thanks again, everybody.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Professor Barbieri. Thank you.
Let me express my
President.
thanks, my many thanks for the very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
That was
All
great.
right.
Thank you, Professor.